Hey there, curious minds. Ever wonder what happens when modern science, with all its fancy equipment, peer-reviewed journals, and Nobel laureates, runs face first into something it absolutely cannot explain? Yeah, that's what we're doing today. We're diving into 5 viral cases that made experts scratch their heads, argue in labs, and occasionally just shrug and walk away. Glowing blue flashes in Texas, faces appearing in concrete floors, animals turned to stone by a lake that shouldn't exist. Sounds like a Netflix horror series, except every single one of these was caught on camera and investigated by actual scientists. Now here's the deal. Some of these phenomena got debunked harder than your uncle's conspiracy theories at Thanksgiving dinner. Others? Still sitting in the we have no idea folder, collecting dust and making physicists uncomfortable. We're bringing in forensic analysts, astrophysicists, NASA geologists, and professional skeptics to separate the mind-blowing from the mind-numbingly fake. So before we jump into the rabbit hole, smash that like button if you're into mysteries that make reality feel a little less reliable, and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from right now? I genuinely want to know who's joining me on this wild ride through the edge of what science can explain. All right, let's get into it. Let's kick things off with something that sounds like it belongs in a science fiction movie, but actually happened in a very ordinary suburban home. March 2017. Spring was just starting to warm up the outskirts of Houston, Texas, a place known for oil refineries, NASA's Johnson Space Center, and enough humidity to make you question every life decision that led you there. Not exactly the setting you'd expect for an encounter with the unexplainable. But then again, the universe has a peculiar sense of humor about where it decides to get weird. Our story begins with a woman named Sandra Holloway, a 34-year-old accountant who spent most of her days wrestling with spreadsheets and tax codes, the kind of person whose biggest daily mystery was usually figuring out why her coffee maker kept making that strange, gurgling noise. Sandra lived alone in a modest 2-story house in one of those cookie-cutter subdivisions where every third house looks identical, and the homeowners association sends you passive-aggressive letters if your lawn gets half an inch too tall. It was, by all accounts, the most aggressively normal place imaginable, which makes what happened next all the more unsettling. On the evening of March 14th, Sandra was doing what millions of Americans do every night. Sitting on her couch, half watching television, half scrolling through her phone, completely unaware that her quiet Tuesday was about to become the subject of internet debates, scientific inquiries, and at least 36 conspiracy theory videos with titles in all caps. The time was approximately 8:47 p.m. She remembers because she had just checked her phone to see if it was too late to order takeout. Spoiler alert, it was not too late for takeout, but it was apparently the perfect time for reality to throw her a curveball she never saw coming. According to Sandra's account, which she later shared with investigators and eventually the internet, she was reaching for the remote control when the entire room suddenly flooded with an intense blue light. Not a gentle blue glow, not a flickering flash like lightning. This was what she described as liquid light, so bright and so saturated that it seemed to have physical weight. The walls, the furniture, her own hands, everything was bathed in this impossible shade of electric blue that she said reminded her of pictures she'd seen of bioluminescent waves, except cranked up to a volume that nature never intended. Now, if this were just a case of someone seeing a weird light, we could chalk it up to any number of explanations. Maybe a transformer blew outside. Maybe someone's car headlights hit the window at a strange angle. Maybe she fell asleep and dreamed the whole thing. But here's where it gets interesting. Sandra had a home security system, one of those modern setups with cameras that record everything, because apparently we've all decided that having constant surveillance of our own homes is a reasonable trade-off for peace of mind. And that camera? It caught the whole thing. The footage, which Sandra uploaded to social media a few weeks after the incident, shows her living room from a corner angle. You can see her sitting on the couch, doing exactly what she described, just existing, being a normal person on a normal night. And then, at the 8:47 mark, the entire frame explodes with blue. It's not gradual. There's no buildup, no warning. One frame, it's a regular living room. The next frame, it looks like someone dunked the camera in a swimming pool filled with glowing Gatorade. The light lasts for approximately 3 seconds, which doesn't sound like much until you realize that 3 seconds is an eternity when you're watching something that shouldn't be happening. But wait, as they say in every infomercial ever made, there's more. When investigators and video analysts started picking apart the footage frame by frame, because of course they did, This is the internet age, and we have nothing better to do than obsess over anomalies. They noticed something peculiar in the minutes leading up to the flash. Sandra's security system also had an exterior camera pointed at her backyard, and in the footage from about 7 minutes before the incident, you can see a group of birds on her roof. Sparrows mostly, maybe a few grackles. Nothing exotic, just your standard suburban bird congregation doing standard suburban bird things. Except they weren't doing standard bird things at all. The birds, all 8 or 9 of them, were completely motionless. Not sleeping, not resting. Frozen. Standing in a row along the roof's edge like little feathered soldiers waiting for inspection. And then, about 4 minutes before the blue flash lit up the interior, they all took off simultaneously. Not one by one, not in a scattered panic like birds usually do when something startles them. They launched into the air at the exact same moment, in the exact same direction, as if they'd received some signal that human senses couldn't detect. Animal behavior experts who later reviewed the footage called it highly unusual, which, in scientific terms, is basically saying, we have no idea what to make of this, but we're too professional to admit we're freaked out. Sandra's personal experience of the event goes beyond what the cameras captured. In interviews, she described a sensation that's difficult to put into words. A feeling that time itself had become syrupy, stretched like taffy, moving at a fraction of its normal speed. She said she could see individual dust particles suspended in the blue light, rotating slowly like tiny planets caught in their own private orbits. She could feel her heartbeat, each thump distinct and separate, as if her body was operating on a different clock than the rest of the universe. This subjective time dilation lasted, by her estimation, somewhere between 30 seconds and several minutes. She couldn't be sure, because how do you measure time when time itself seems to have lost interest in behaving normally? And then, as suddenly as it began, it was over. The blue light vanished. The room returned to its normal, boring, incandescent-lit state. Sandra was left sitting on her couch, remote control still in her outstretched hand, wondering if she had just experienced something profound, or if she needed to schedule an appointment with a neurologist. The television was still playing whatever show she'd been ignoring. Her phone was still in her lap. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. Like waking up from a dream so vivid that the real world seems fake by comparison. In the days and weeks that followed, Sandra began experiencing something else that she hesitates to connect to the incident, but can't quite dismiss either. Dreams. Vivid, recurring dreams unlike anything she'd had before. In these dreams, she wasn't on Earth. She was floating in space, surrounded by galaxies and nebulae, watching stars being born and die in what felt like real time. She could see cosmic structures she had no words for, spiraling formations of light and matter that seemed to communicate something just beyond her understanding. She'd wake up with tears streaming down her face, overwhelmed by a sense of beauty and terror that faded, but never fully disappeared. Now I know what you're thinking. Dreams are just dreams. The human brain does weird things, especially after experiencing something traumatic or unusual. Stress can trigger vivid nightmares. Changes in routine can alter sleep patterns. And maybe Sandra just watched too many space documentaries, and her subconscious decided to remix them into a nightly cosmic show. All of that is entirely possible. But Sandra insists she'd never been particularly interested in astronomy before the incident. Space was fine, stars were pretty, but she wasn't the type to watch NASA live streams or read articles about black holes. The sudden appearance of these intensely detailed cosmic visions felt, to her, like receiving a transmission she hadn't asked for. The video went viral, as these things tend to do. Within weeks, it had millions of views across various platforms, and the comment sections became battlegrounds between believers who were convinced Sandra had witnessed something extraterrestrial, and skeptics who were equally convinced it was an elaborate hoax. Some people suggested it was a transformer explosion, which would explain a bright flash, but not the specific blue color or the duration. Others proposed ball lightning, a rare but documented phenomenon, except ball lightning typically moves and behaves erratically, and this was a uniform static illumination. A few armchair experts suggested gas leaks causing hallucinations, conveniently ignoring that gas leaks don't typically show up on video cameras. The video attracted the attention of several investigative teams who specialize in analyzing exactly this kind of footage. Among them was a photo analyst named Marcus Chen, who had spent over a decade working with law enforcement agencies to detect manipulated images and videos. Marcus approached the footage with the skepticism of someone who has seen every trick in the Photoshop book and invented a few new ones himself. His initial assumption, he later admitted, was that this would be a relatively straightforward case of video editing. Some After Effects work, maybe a practical light effect, something that would reveal itself under scrutiny. What he found instead was deeply perplexing. When Marcus examined the footage frame by frame, he discovered something that shouldn't have been there, or rather, something that should have been there but wasn't. During the 3 seconds of blue illumination, there were approximately 4 frames that appeared to be missing from the timeline. Not corrupted, not glitched, missing. The timecode jumped, suggesting that the camera had simply stopped recording for a fraction of a second and then resumed. Security cameras don't typically do this. They're designed for continuous recording precisely because gaps in footage defeat their entire purpose. Yet there it was, a tiny hole in the visual record that no one could explain. Even more troubling was what Marcus noticed about the shadows, or rather, the absence of them. When a bright light source illuminates a room, it creates shadows. That's not opinion, that's physics. Every object blocks some portion of the light, casting a shadow in the opposite direction. But during the blue flash in Sandra's living room, the shadows behaved incorrectly. Some objects that should have cast distinct shadows didn't appear to cast any at all. Others had shadows that pointed in directions that made no geometric sense given a single light source. It was as if the light wasn't coming from any specific point, but was instead emerging from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Which, last time anyone checked, isn't how light works in our particular corner of reality. A forensic investigator named Rachel Torres decided to run her own experiments. If this was a conventional light source, a very bright lamp, a camera flash, even an electrical arc, she should be able to recreate the visual effect in a controlled environment. She tried everything: halogen floods, LED arrays, xenon flashes, photography strobes. She even tracked down a decommissioned transformer and, with appropriate safety precautions, deliberately overloaded it to see what kind of light it produced. Nothing matched. Every artificial light source she tested produced shadows that behaved exactly as physics predicted they should. None of them created the flat, omnidirectional illumination visible in Sandra's footage. Meanwhile, a meteorologist named Dr. Patricia Webb pulled the radar data and weather records for that exact location and time. If this was lightning, even some exotic form of lightning that hadn't been previously documented, there should be evidence in the atmospheric data. There wasn't. The skies over Houston that evening were clear. No thunderstorms within 100 miles. No unusual electrical activity detected by any monitoring station. No reports of power surges or outages in the area. Whatever caused that blue flash, it didn't originate from any atmospheric phenomenon that current science knows how to track. This is where the theories start getting creative. Some researchers have suggested that what Sandra witnessed might have been what they call a temporal anomaly, a localized disturbance in the fabric of space-time itself. Before you roll your eyes and click away, hear this out. Modern physics acknowledges that space-time isn't the rigid, unchanging structure we experience in daily life. It can be warped by gravity, stretched by velocity, and theoretically, though we've never observed it directly, might contain imperfections or fluctuations that manifest in ways we don't yet understand. The missing frames on the video, Sandra's perception of time slowing down, the impossible behavior of the light and shadows, all of these could, if you squint hard enough and have a very open mind, be consistent with a brief local distortion in how time and space interact. Is this explanation likely? Honestly, probably not. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and while Sandra's experience is certainly unusual, it falls short of proving that the laws of physics took a coffee break over her living room. But it's worth noting that this hypothesis hasn't been definitively ruled out either. Unlike the transformer theory or the ball lightning theory, which can be tested and have been found wanting, the temporal anomaly theory exists in that frustrating gray zone where it can't be proven, but also can't be disproven with current technology. What we're left with, then, is a genuinely puzzling case. A video that shows something unusual happening, expert analysis that rules out the most obvious explanations, a witness whose account is consistent and whose credibility hasn't been seriously challenged, and a phenomenon that, despite years of scrutiny, remains filed under Unexplained. This doesn't mean it's supernatural or extraterrestrial or evidence of parallel dimensions bleeding into our reality. It might have a perfectly mundane explanation that simply hasn't occurred to anyone yet. But until that explanation emerges, The blue anomaly of Houston joins a small but growing collection of documented events that remind us how much we still don't understand about the world we think we know. Sandra still lives in the same house, by the way. She thought about moving after the incident, considered it seriously, in fact, but ultimately decided that running away wouldn't change anything. The experience happened. It's part of her story now, and she's made peace with not having answers. She still has the dreams occasionally, though they've become less frequent over time. She describes them as visits now, rather than intrusions. Moments of cosmic tourism that she's learned to appreciate rather than fear. Whether these dreams are psychological echoes of a traumatic experience or something more, she doesn't claim to know. She just knows that ever since that March evening, she looks up at the night sky differently. Not with fear, but with the quiet recognition that the universe is much stranger and much more vast than anything happening in a suburban living room even. One briefly flooded with impossible blue light. So where does all of this leave us with the Houston blue flash? After months of analysis, after frame-by-frame examination, after experiments with every conceivable light source, after pulling weather data and interviewing witnesses and doing everything short of sacrificing a goat to the gods of scientific inquiry, the expert panel reached a conclusion that will either satisfy you or drive you absolutely crazy, depending on your tolerance for ambiguity. Their verdict? Unexplained. Not fake, not debunked, not confirmed as supernatural, just genuinely, frustratingly unexplained. The missing frames remain missing. The impossible shadows remain impossible. The phenomenon sits in that uncomfortable space where science shrugs its shoulders and says, "We don't know yet, but we're not ready to call it magic." Some investigators have continued to push the temporal anomaly theory, the idea that what Sandra witnessed was a localized glitch in space-time, a brief moment where the normal rules took a vacation. It sounds like science fiction, and honestly, it probably is. But here's the thing that keeps this theory alive in certain circles. We know space-time can behave strangely under extreme conditions. Black holes warp it, massive objects bend it. High velocities slow it down. The universe has already proven that time and space aren't the rigid, unchanging framework we experience in our daily lives. So while a random glitch appearing in a suburban Houston living room seems absurd, it's not technically impossible, just extraordinarily unlikely. And in the world of unexplained phenomena, extraordinarily unlikely is basically Tuesday. The case remains open, at least unofficially. No one has come forward with a confession of hoax. No one has identified the light source. Sandra continues to live her life, have her cosmic dreams occasionally, and politely decline most interview requests because, understandably, she's tired of being treated like either a fraud or a prophet, depending on who's asking. The blue anomaly joins a small collection of documented events that resist easy explanation. Not proof of anything extraordinary, but a reminder that our understanding of reality might have a few more gaps than we'd like to admit. But enough about mysterious lights. Let's travel across the Atlantic to a place where the unexplained decided to get personal. Very personal. And also deeply, deeply creepy. We're going to Spain. Specifically to a tiny village that most people had never heard of, until something started appearing in the concrete floor of a kitchen. Something that looked back. The year was 1971. The place was Belmez de la Moraleda, a village in the Andalusian province of Jaén that had approximately 1,000 residents and exactly 0 reasons to be famous. This was rural Spain at its most rural. Olive groves, whitewashed houses, old women in black dresses gossiping in doorways, and a pace of life so slow that watching paint dry would qualify as entertainment. The biggest excitement most residents could expect was the annual festival, or maybe an unusually large harvest. Nobody was prepared for what was about to happen in the home of the Pereira family, and honestly, nobody would have believed it if it hadn't been witnessed by so many people. Carmen Pereira was 60 years old, a grandmother who had lived in the same house her entire married life. It was a modest home, nothing special. Fixed stone walls, small windows, a kitchen with a concrete floor that had been poured sometime in the previous decade. Carmen spent most of her days doing what women of her generation did in rural Spanish villages: cooking, cleaning, attending mass, and minding everyone else's business while pretending not to. Her life was routine in the most comfortable sense of the word. That routine was about to get severely disrupted. On the morning of August 23, 1971, Carmen walked into her kitchen to prepare breakfast and noticed something odd on the floor. There was a stain near the fireplace, a discoloration in the concrete that she didn't remember seeing before. At first, she assumed it was nothing, maybe a watermark or some kind of residue that could be scrubbed away. She got down on her knees with a brush and cleaning solution and went to work. The stain didn't budge. If anything, it seemed to become more defined as she scrubbed, which is the exact opposite of what stains are supposed to do. That was strange, but not alarming. Old houses have quirks. Concrete does weird things sometimes. Carmen finished her breakfast preparations and tried not to think about it. Over the following days, the stain began to change. It wasn't just a random discoloration anymore. It was taking shape. Slowly, gradually, like a photograph developing in a darkroom, features began to emerge from the concrete. The curve of what looked like a cheek. The shadow of what might be an eye socket. A line that could, if you squinted, be interpreted as a mouth. By the end of the first week, Carmen was no longer scrubbing, she was staring. Because looking up at her from the floor of her kitchen was something that unmistakably resembled a human face. Now, before we go any further, let's acknowledge the obvious skeptical explanation. Pareidolia. Humans are hardwired to see faces everywhere. We see them in clouds, in tree bark, in the front grills of cars, in burnt toast. Our brains are pattern recognition machines that are so obsessed with identifying faces that they'll find them where none exist. So a random stain on a concrete floor that vaguely resembles a face? That's not supernatural. That's just neurons doing what neurons do. Carmen Pereira was probably just an elderly woman with too much imagination and not enough entertainment options. Case closed, right? Except the face kept getting clearer. And it wasn't alone. Carmen's husband, Miguel, was not the type of man to believe in ghosts or spirits, or anything that couldn't be explained by common sense and a stiff drink. When Carmen showed him the face on the floor, his first reaction was annoyance. His second reaction was to grab a pickaxe. If there was something weird in the concrete, the solution was obvious. Destroy the concrete, pour new concrete, problem solved. This was the 1971 Spanish countryside approach to the supernatural. Don't call a priest, call a mason. Miguel spent an afternoon breaking up the kitchen floor, hauling away the debris, and laying fresh concrete. He smoothed it perfectly, let it cure, and declared the matter settled. The face was gone. Normalcy had been restored. Everyone could go back to their regularly scheduled lives of olive farming and church attendance. The face came back. Within a week, it had re-emerged in the new concrete, in almost exactly the same spot, with almost exactly the same features. And this time, it brought friends. Over the following months, more faces began appearing throughout the kitchen floor. Not just vague stains that could be interpreted as faces if you tried hard enough. Distinct, detailed visages with recognizable expressions. Some looked peaceful, others looked anguished. A few seemed to be screaming. They varied in size, from barely larger than a coin to nearly a foot across. They appeared in different parts of the floor, sometimes overlapping, sometimes clustered together like some kind of concrete portrait gallery from hell. Carmen stopped using her kitchen. Honestly, who could blame her? Imagine trying to fry an egg while a dozen spectral faces stare up at you from the floor, silently judging your cooking technique. That's not a kitchen anymore. That's a psychological horror movie set. Word spread through Belmez de la Moraleda faster than gossip at a family reunion. Neighbors came to see the faces, then friends of neighbors, then strangers from other villages, then journalists, then researchers, then absolutely everyone with even a passing interest in the paranormal, which, in 1970s Spain, turned out to be a surprisingly large number of people. The Pereira house became an attraction, and the faces of Belmez became national news. Experts arrived from universities. Church officials came to investigate. Television crews set up cameras in the kitchen. Carmen Pereira, who had spent 60 years in comfortable obscurity, was suddenly the most famous grandmother in Spain, though not exactly for reasons she would have chosen. The explanations offered ranged from the mundane to the metaphysical. Skeptics suggested that someone, possibly Carmen herself, possibly a family member, possibly a clever neighbor, was creating the faces deliberately, using chemicals or dyes that could seep through concrete and create images. Believers countered that the faces had been witnessed forming in real time by multiple independent observers, and that no one had ever detected any tampering or artificial materials. The debate raged in newspapers, academic journals, and village plazas, with neither side able to definitively prove their case. And then someone decided to dig beneath the house. Because when strange faces start appearing in your floor, the logical next step is obviously to find out what's underneath it. A team of excavators arrived, broke through the concrete, and began removing soil from beneath the Pereira kitchen. What they found didn't exactly calm anyone's nerves. Human bones. Lots of them. The house, it turned out, had been built on top of a forgotten cemetery from the 19th century, a burial ground that had been covered over and built upon decades earlier, its existence erased from official records and local memory. The skeletons beneath the Pereira kitchen were the remains of villagers who had died generations ago, their graves unmarked and their names lost to history. For the believers, this discovery was proof positive of what was happening. The faces weren't random stains or hoaxes. They were the spirits of the dead, emerging through the concrete to make their presence known, to remind the living that they were still there, still watching, still part of the house that had been built over, their final resting place. The theory had a certain poetic logic to it, the kind of ghost story that practically writes itself. Restless dead, disturbed graves, manifestations from beyond. It was enough to make even the most hardened skeptic pause for a moment before remembering that poetic logic isn't the same as actual evidence. The bones were eventually removed and given proper reburials. The concrete was torn up and replaced yet again, and the faces? They kept appearing. Whatever was causing them, it apparently wasn't satisfied by the exhumation. New faces emerged in the new concrete, sometimes within days of it being poured. Different faces, with different expressions, as if the floor had become a rotating gallery of spectral portraiture. The phenomenon continued for years, through multiple floor replacements, through Carmen's death in 2004, through decades of investigation and controversy. As of the most recent reports, the faces are still there, still staring up from the floor of a house in a small Spanish village that never asked to become the world's creepiest tourist destination. The Belmez faces represent one of the most thoroughly documented cases of alleged paranormal activity in modern history. Hundreds of photographs exist. Dozens of researchers have examined the site. Multiple laboratories have analyzed samples from the concrete. And yet, despite half a century of scrutiny, no one has been able to definitively prove either that the faces are genuine supernatural manifestations or that they're the product of human trickery. They exist in that maddening gray zone where the evidence is too strong to dismiss, but too weak to confirm. Permanent residents of the Unexplained file, staring up at us with expressions that seem to ask why we haven't figured them out yet. The scientific community, as you might imagine, was not content to let the faces of Belmez remain in the realm of village folklore and paranormal speculation. Over the decades since their first appearance, numerous researchers have descended upon that small Spanish house with every analytical tool modern science can offer, determined to either explain the phenomenon or expose it as an elaborate hoax. The results of these investigations are, depending on your perspective, either deeply unsatisfying or genuinely fascinating. In 2014, a team from a prominent chemical analysis laboratory conducted the most comprehensive examination to date. They brought in infrared scanning equipment, spectrometers, and enough sophisticated machinery to make CSI look like amateur hour. Their mission was straightforward: find the paint, find the dye. Find the bleach, the ink, the chemical agent, find whatever substance was being used to create these images. Because if the faces were man-made, there had to be evidence. You can't paint on concrete without leaving traces, and modern analytical chemistry can detect compounds at concentrations that would make your average hoaxer weep with despair. The results came back clean. No paint, no artificial dyes, no chemical agents that didn't belong in normal concrete. The infrared scans showed no evidence of surface application, no brush strokes, no layering, no signs that anything had been applied to the floor from above. Whatever was causing these faces, it wasn't coming from a bottle or a can. The concrete was just concrete. Concrete that happened to have human faces appearing in it for reasons that chemistry couldn't explain. The laboratory team, being scientists, did not conclude that the faces were supernatural. They simply noted that they could not identify the mechanism of formation using available analytical methods. Which is scientists speak for, we have no idea, but we're not about to say it's ghosts. A researcher named Thomas Bradford, who had spent years studying alleged miraculous phenomena for the Catholic Church, offered an interesting comparison. He pointed to a case in Austria where a religious image had appeared spontaneously on a church wall. a case that had been thoroughly investigated and ultimately recognized by church authorities as potentially miraculous. Bradford noted the similarities. Both involved images appearing on solid surfaces without apparent human intervention. Both had been witnessed by multiple observers. Both had resisted easy explanation. But he also noted a crucial difference. The Austrian case involved a single image that appeared once and remained static. The Belmez faces were multiple, changing, and seemed to respond to attention. New faces appearing when the phenomenon was being observed, expressions shifting over time. If this was a miracle, it was a remarkably interactive one, which didn't quite fit the profile of recognized religious phenomena. On the opposite end of the spectrum, skeptical investigators proposed a theory that was elegant in its simplicity. Bleach. Specifically, diluted bleach applied to concrete in careful patterns, which would lighten the surface and create visible images before evaporating completely, leaving no chemical trace. It was a clever hypothesis. Bleach is readily available, easy to use, and, crucially, breaks down into compounds that are already present in concrete, making it theoretically undetectable after the fact. A hoaxer with patience, artistic skill, and access to household cleaning products could, in principle, create images that would baffle chemical analysis. The problem with this theory is that it requires a hoaxer. And despite decades of investigation, despite offers of money for information, despite the deaths of the original witnesses who might have had motive to confess, no one has ever come forward to claim responsibility. No deathbed confession. No bitter family member revealing secrets. No prankster looking for their 15 minutes of fame. If the Belmez faces are a hoax, they're the most committed, most disciplined, most secretive hoax in the history of paranormal fakery. The person or persons responsible would have had to maintain their deception for over 50 years, continuing to create new faces even after the original witnesses died, even after public interest waned, even after there was no longer any conceivable benefit to keeping the fraud alive. That level of dedication to a prank seems, frankly, more improbable than some of the supernatural explanations. So where does that leave us? In the same frustrating place where we left the Houston Blue Flash, unexplained. The Belmez faces haven't been proven real, but they haven't been proven fake either. They exist in that uncomfortable limbo where evidence is abundant, but conclusions are elusive. Believers continue to visit the house, hoping for a glimpse of the phenomenon. Skeptics continue to insist that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. Just because we haven't found the trick doesn't mean there isn't one. And the faces, presumably, continue to stare up from the concrete floor, keeping their secrets with the patience of the dead they may or may not represent. But let's shift gears from mysterious images to something even more unsettling. A place where death isn't hidden or metaphorical, but on full, horrifying display. A place where animals don't just die. They become monuments to their own demise. Frozen in poses so lifelike that they look like they could wake up at any moment, except they absolutely will not because they've been chemically transformed into something closer to statues than corpses. Welcome to Lake Natron, Tanzania, quite possibly the most metal body of water on planet Earth. The year was 2010, and a British wildlife photographer named Nick Brandt was working on a project documenting the landscapes of East Africa. Brandt had spent years photographing the region's animals and ecosystems, building a reputation for striking black and white images that captured both the beauty and the fragility of African wildlife. But nothing in his previous work had prepared him for what he found along the shores of Lake Natron in northern Tanzania, near the border with Kenya. What he discovered there would become one of the most viral nature photography series of the decade, and would spawn countless theories ranging from the scientific to the supernatural. Scattered along the lake's shoreline, Brandt found dead animals. That in itself wasn't unusual. Death is a constant presence in nature, and any body of water will accumulate casualties over time. What was unusual was the condition of these animals. They weren't decomposing. They weren't being consumed by scavengers. They were intact, posed, and calcified, transformed into what looked like statues carved by a sculptor with a dark sense of humor. There were flamingos standing upright, wings spread as if frozen mid-flight, songbirds perched on branches they would never leave, bats hanging with their wings extended, caught in a moment of eternal glide. An eagle with its head thrown back, captured in what looked like a silent scream at the sky. The images Brandt captured were haunting. He posed the specimens he found, arranging them in naturalistic positions that emphasized the eerie preservation of their forms, and photographed them against the stark landscape of the lake. When these photos hit the internet, they spread like wildfire. Here was visual evidence of something that seemed impossible. A lake that could turn living creatures into stone, like some kind of geological Medusa. The headlines wrote themselves. Lake of Death. The lake that turns animals to statues. The most dangerous body of water on Earth. Social media had a field day. Naturally, the theories started flowing almost immediately. Some people latched onto local folklore, specifically the legend of Popobawa, a malevolent spirit from Tanzanian mythology that was said to terrorize communities along the East African coast. Popobawa, according to tradition, was a shapeshifter that attacked people in their homes, and while it was typically associated with areas much further from Lake Natron, that didn't stop enthusiastic internet commenters from connecting the dots. Maybe the lake was cursed. Maybe Popobawa had expanded his territory. Maybe there was some ancient evil lurking beneath those blood-red waters, reaching up to claim anything that dared approach. Other explanations focused on the lake's bizarre appearance. Lake Natron isn't your typical scenic body of water. Depending on the season and the algae blooms, it can appear bright red, deep orange, or unsettling pink. Colors that look more like something from a science fiction movie than terrestrial geography. This coloration comes from cyanobacteria, microorganisms that thrive in the lake's extremely salty, extremely alkaline waters and produce red pigments as a byproduct of their metabolism. The whole scene looks apocalyptic, like the kind of landscape where nothing should survive. So when photos emerged showing perfectly preserved animal corpses along its shores, it seemed to confirm what the visuals suggested. This place was death itself, concentrated into liquid form. But here's where the story gets interesting, and where the truth proves to be more nuanced and arguably more fascinating than the mythology. Because Lake Natron isn't actually a death trap. In fact, it's one of the most important breeding grounds for wildlife in the entire region. And the animals that supposedly fell victim to its deadly waters, they didn't die by swimming into a chemical bath. The reality is simultaneously less dramatic and more scientifically remarkable than the viral headlines suggested. Let's talk about what Lake Natron actually is. It's a soda lake, meaning its waters contain extremely high concentrations of sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, the same compounds found in baking soda and washing soda. These chemicals leach into the lake from the surrounding volcanic geology, specifically from a nearby volcano called Oldoño Lengai, which erupts a uniquely sodium-rich lava. The result is water with a pH somewhere between 9 and 10.5, making it extremely alkaline. Not quite as caustic as household bleach, but definitely not something you'd want to swim in without very good reason. The water temperature can also reach up to 140 degrees Fahrenheit in some areas, because apparently the lake decided that being chemically hostile wasn't enough, and added, literally cooking you to its repertoire. Now here's the paradox that makes Lake Natron so fascinating. Despite these seemingly deadly conditions, or rather because of them, the lake is home to one of the largest and most important flamingo breeding colonies in the world. Approximately 75% of the global population of lesser flamingos is born at Lake Natron. These birds don't just survive there, they thrive, returning year after year to nest on the lake's caustic shores. The same conditions that would kill most animals have created a perfect sanctuary for flamingos, whose specialized biology allows them to filter feed in the alkaline water, whose thick, scaly legs resist the chemical burns that would devastate other species, and whose nesting sites on the salt flats are protected from predators by the very hostility of the environment. No lion is going to wade through caustic soda soup to snack on flamingo eggs. It's evolution's version of building your house on a toxic waste dump and calling it home security. So if the lake isn't killing flamingos en masse, where did all those calcified corpses come from? The answer involves both natural processes and a bit of artistic license. Animals do die at Lake Natron as they die everywhere. Some drown. Some die of exhaustion during migration. Some simply reach the end of their natural lifespans. When these animals end up in or near the lake's waters, something remarkable happens. The high concentrations of sodium carbonate and bicarbonate act as a preservative, essentially mummifying the remains. The same chemical compounds that ancient Egyptians used in the mummification process, natron, which gets its name from the region where it was historically mined, prevent decomposition and can gradually calcify organic tissue. The animals don't turn to stone instantly. It's a process that takes time, with the minerals slowly replacing or coating the organic matter. What this means is that the statues Brandt photographed weren't animals that had been killed by the lake. They were animals that had died by various natural causes and were then preserved by the lake's unique chemistry. The lake isn't a killer. It's more like a very aggressive taxidermist, taking whatever corpses drift its way and transforming them into eerily lifelike monuments. Now let's address the elephant in the room, or rather the demon in the lake. Remember Popobawa, that malevolent shape-shifting spirit from Tanzanian folklore that some internet commenters were so eager to blame for the petrified animals? A wildlife biologist named Dr. Elena Mwangi, who specializes in East African ecosystems and has spent considerable time studying Lake Natron, had a rather straightforward rebuttal to this theory. According to traditional accounts, Popobawa attacks humans. Specifically, the spirit is said to terrorize people in their homes, particularly at night, and has been blamed for everything from sleep paralysis to unexplained injuries to general bad vibes in coastal Tanzanian communities. What Popobawa does not do, according to any version of the legend Dr. Mwangi could find, is hang around remote lakes petrifying flamingos for artistic effect. The demon, whatever its actual existence status, has a very specific job description, and turning birds into statues isn't on the resume. So unless Popobawa decided to pivot careers and move from home invasion to wildlife photography, we can probably rule that one out. With the supernatural explanation dismissed, at least the one involving shape-shifting spirits with questionable hobby choices, let's talk about what's actually happening at Lake Natron. For this, we turn to people who study rocks and chemistry for a living, specifically a geologist named Dr. James Whitmore, who works with NASA's astrobiology program. You might wonder what NASA has to do with a lake in Tanzania, but it turns out that extreme environments on Earth are excellent analogs for conditions we might find on other planets. Lake Natron, with its bizarre chemistry and hostile conditions, is exactly the kind of place astrobiologists love to study because if life can thrive here, maybe life can thrive in similarly harsh environments elsewhere in the solar system. Europa's subsurface oceans, anyone? Dr. Whitmore explained the Lake Natron phenomenon in terms that even those of us who slept through chemistry class can appreciate. The lake sits in a volcanic region, fed by hot springs that bubble up through mineral-rich rock. The nearby Oldonyo Lengai volcano, whose name translates to Mountain of God in the Maasai language, which is either poetic or deeply ironic given what it produces, erupts a type of lava that's unique in the world. This isn't your typical red-hot molten rock. It's nitrocarbonatite, a lava so rich in sodium and carbonate compounds that it actually erupts at relatively cool temperatures and looks almost black when it flows. Over thousands of years, this unusual volcanic activity has saturated the lake and its surroundings with sodium carbonate and sodium bicarbonate, creating one of the most alkaline bodies of water on the planet. The pH of Lake Natron hovers between 9 and 10.5, depending on where you measure and what season it is. For reference, pure water has a pH of 7, household ammonia is around 11, and drain cleaner hits about 14. So Lake Natron isn't quite at the dissolve your pipes level, but it's definitely in the don't go swimming unless you're a flamingo category. This extreme alkalinity, combined with the high concentration of dissolved minerals and water temperatures that can exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit, creates conditions that are profoundly hostile to most forms of life, but absolutely perfect for preservation. Here's where the ancient Egyptians enter the story, because history has a way of connecting the most unlikely dots. The process that preserves dead animals at Lake Natron is essentially the same process that Egyptian embalmers used to mummify pharaohs over 3,000 years ago. The key ingredient? Natron. Yes, the mineral compound gets its name from the same root as the lake, and for good reason. Ancient Egyptians harvested natron from dried lake beds in the Nile Delta and used it to desiccate and preserve bodies destined for the afterlife. They'd pack the deceased in natron salts for 40 days, allowing the minerals to draw out moisture and kill bacteria that would otherwise cause decomposition. The result was preservation so effective that we can still study Egyptian mummies today, thousands of years after they were prepared. Lake Natron does essentially the same thing, just without the ceremonial wrappings and fancy sarcophagi. When an animal dies in or near the lake, whether from natural causes, exhaustion, accident, or simple bad luck, the mineral-rich water and salts begin the preservation process almost immediately. Sodium carbonate and bicarbonate penetrate the tissue, replacing water and preventing the bacterial growth that normally breaks down organic matter. Over time, the remains become increasingly calcified, coated in mineral deposits that give them that eerie, statue-like appearance. It's not instantaneous transformation, it's gradual mummification, The same basic chemistry that the pharaoh's priests spent years perfecting, happening naturally on the shores of a Tanzanian lake. So the mystery of Lake Natron's stone animals has a scientific explanation after all. No demons, no curses, no supernatural death rays emanating from the water. Just chemistry, geology, and the peculiar intersection of volcanic activity and biological processes. The lake isn't killing animals. It's preserving the ones that happen to die there. The dramatic headlines about a death lake were technically accurate. Animals do die, and the lake does transform their bodies. But deeply misleading about the actual danger level. Lake Natron isn't more deadly than any other body of water. It's just better at keeping souvenirs. But wait, there's one more twist to this story, and it's a good one. Remember Nick Brandt, the photographer whose haunting images kicked off the whole viral sensation? In later interviews about the project, Brandt made a confession that added an important layer of context to those famous photographs. He didn't just find the calcified animals posed dramatically along the shoreline. He arranged them himself. Let that sink in for a moment. The flamingos standing with wings spread, the songbirds perched on branches, the eagle with its head thrown back in what looked like a frozen scream. None of them were found that way. Brandt collected specimens that had washed up on shore, already calcified by the lake's chemistry, and then posed them in naturalistic positions before photographing them. The animals were real. The preservation was real. But the dramatic compositions that made the images so striking and so shareable were the product of artistic direction, not natural circumstance. This doesn't make the photos fake, exactly. The calcification process genuinely happens at Lake Natron, and the specimens Brandt photographed were genuinely preserved by the lake's unique chemistry. But it does complicate the narrative that circulated alongside the images. Those viral posts suggesting that animals were being turned to stone mid-flight, frozen in their final moments by some instantaneous petrification process. That was never the reality. The truth was more mundane, but also more interesting. A photographer with an artist's eye found naturally preserved specimens and arranged them to create images that told a story about death and beauty in one of the world's harshest environments. Brandt himself was upfront about this in interviews, though that context rarely made it into the viral reposts. He described the project as an artistic meditation on the fragility of life and the strange beauty that can emerge from hostile conditions. The poses were intentional, meant to evoke movement and life precisely because the subjects were so thoroughly dead. It was commentary, not documentation, art, not evidence. And yet, stripped of that context, the images became proof of supernatural phenomena, fuel for conspiracy theories, and clickbait fodder for websites that never bothered to check whether the story they were telling was actually true. There's a lesson here about how information travels in the internet age, but we'll save the media literacy lecture for another time. For now, let's just note that Lake Natron has been officially moved from our Unexplained file to our Explained but still really cool file. The chemistry is real. The preservation is real. The flamingos really do thrive in conditions that would kill most other animals. And the photographs, while artistically staged, documented a genuine natural phenomenon. Sometimes the scientific explanation turns out to be just as fascinating as the supernatural one, with the added bonus of actually being true. The Popobawa, meanwhile, remains unemployed as far as lake-based petrification goes. Perhaps the demon should consider updating its LinkedIn profile. In this economy, diversifying your skill set never hurts, though turning flamingos to stone is admittedly a niche market. What makes the Lake Natron story particularly instructive is how quickly the sensational version overwhelmed the accurate one. Within days of Brandt's photographs going viral, the narrative had calcified, pun absolutely intended, into a simple, scary story. Deadly lake turns animals to stone. The nuance was stripped away faster than you can say clickbait. The fact that the lake is actually a vital breeding habitat? Ignored. The explanation involving volcanic chemistry and natural preservation? Too complicated for headlines. The photographer's own admission that he staged the compositions? Buried in interviews that nobody read because they'd already shared the spooky photos and moved on to the next viral sensation? This pattern repeats itself constantly in the age of social media. A genuinely interesting phenomenon gets discovered, stripped of context, packaged into something shocking, and launched into the digital ecosystem where it mutates further with each share. By the time the fact-checkers catch up, the misinformation has circled the globe twice and set up permanent residence in people's mental model of the world. There are probably millions of people who still believe Lake Natron is some kind of instant death trap, unaware that flamingos raise their babies there every single year and have been doing so for longer than humans have been paying attention. The irony is that the true story of Lake Natron is arguably more interesting than the fake one. A lake so alkaline that it preserves dead animals like natural mummies? That's fascinating. A volcanic system that produces unique lava unlike anywhere else on Earth? That's remarkable. An ecosystem so extreme that it's being studied by NASA as an analog for potential extraterrestrial environments? That's the kind of thing that should be making headlines. But weird chemistry explains unusual preservation doesn't generate the same engagement as Demon Lake turns birds to stone. So here we are, constantly fighting an uphill battle against our own collective preference for the dramatic over the accurate. Dr. Mwangi, the biologist who debunked the Popobawa theory, has spoken about this frustration in subsequent interviews. She spent her career studying East African ecosystems, working to protect endangered species and preserve critical habitats. And along comes one viral photo series that teaches more people wrong things about Lake Natron than all her research papers. Combined, taught people correct things. The flamingos she's dedicated her professional life to protecting are now famous, but famous for the wrong reasons, associated with death and danger rather than resilience and remarkable adaptation. It's enough to make a scientist want to throw her hands up and become a hermit. Except hermits don't get research funding. The Lake Natron case also highlights something important about how we process images in the digital age. Photographs feel like evidence in a way that words don't. When you see a picture of a calcified flamingo, frozen in a lifelike pose against a blood-red lake, your brain accepts it as documentation of reality. The aesthetic power of the image bypasses your critical faculties and goes straight to your emotional response center. It looks real, therefore it must be real, and the story attached to it must also be real. Never mind that the pose was arranged by a photographer. Never mind that the context has been stripped away. Never mind that the interpretation being offered contradicts basic biology. The image is compelling, so the narrative is accepted. This is why visual literacy is becoming as important as traditional literacy in the modern world. We need to learn to ask questions about images the same way we ask questions about text. Who took this photo? Why? What was their intent? What context might be missing? Is the caption accurately describing what I'm seeing, or is it spinning a story that the image alone doesn't support? These questions don't come naturally to most of us, because for most of human history, images were relatively difficult to produce and distribute. If you saw a photograph, it was probably in a newspaper or a book, curated by editors with professional standards. Now anyone can snap a picture, add a caption, and send it around the world in seconds. And our collective capacity to evaluate what we're seeing hasn't caught up to our capacity to share it. But enough philosophy about media literacy. We've got more unexplained phenomena to investigate. Lake Natron turned out to have a perfectly rational explanation, even if that explanation got lost in the viral shuffle. Our next case, however, is going to test the boundaries of what rational explanation can even mean. We're heading to the realm of impossible disappearances, where people and vehicles seem to vanish into thin air, leaving behind only questions and grainy security footage that raises more mysteries than it solves. All right, we've dealt with mysterious lights, faces in concrete, and a lake that moonlights as a taxidermist. Now we're venturing into territory that makes those phenomena look almost quaint by comparison. We're talking about teleportation, the idea that objects or people can instantaneously move from one location to another without traveling through the space in between. It's a concept that's been a staple of science fiction since before science fiction was even a genre. From ancient religious texts describing prophets being transported by divine intervention, to Star Trek's iconic transporter beam. Beam Me Up, Scotty has become so embedded in popular culture that people who've never watched a single episode of the show know exactly what it means. But here's the thing. What if teleportation isn't just fiction? What if there's evidence, actual, recorded, analyzed evidence, suggesting that sometimes, just sometimes, the impossible actually happens? Our first case takes us back to Texas, because apparently that state has some kind of contractual agreement with the unexplained. It's December 2019. The holiday season is in full swing, and a man named Robert Dawson is heading out for what he assumes will be a perfectly ordinary evening. Robert lives in Porter, a small community about 30 miles northeast of Houston. Close enough to the city for convenience, far enough to avoid the worst of the traffic and enjoy something resembling peace and quiet. Like many homeowners in 2019, Robert has a smart doorbell equipped with a camera. One of those devices that lets you see who's at your door, even when you're not home. and, more importantly for our purposes, records everything that happens on your front porch whether you want it to or not. On the evening in question, Robert steps out his front door at approximately 7:23 p.m. The doorbell camera captures him clearly, a middle-aged man in a jacket, keys in hand, heading out into the mild December evening. Nothing unusual about the scene whatsoever. Robert walks across his porch, down the steps, and onto the pathway leading to his driveway. And then, according to the footage, he ceases to exist. The video shows Robert walking normally for several steps. Then there's a brief flash. Witnesses who've analyzed the footage describe it as a sphere of light, roughly the size of a basketball, appearing where Robert's torso should be. The flash lasts for maybe a quarter of a second, barely enough time to register, and when it's gone, so is Robert. The pathway is empty. The man who was walking across it a fraction of a second earlier has simply vanished, leaving behind nothing but confused physics and a security camera that captured the whole impossible sequence. Now, before you start drafting your "humans can teleport" thesis, let's acknowledge some important context. Robert Dawson didn't stay vanished. He showed up at his destination that evening, arrived home later that night, and by all accounts, continued living his perfectly normal life. He doesn't claim to have experienced anything unusual, no sensation of being transported, no memory gap, no cosmic revelation about the nature of reality. From his perspective, he walked to his car and drove away, same as any other evening. The anomaly exists only on the recording, which raises an obvious question. Is the video showing us something that actually happened, or is it showing us something that went wrong with the video? The footage went viral, naturally, because anything even remotely suggesting supernatural activity is guaranteed to spread across the internet faster than a celebrity scandal. Paranormal enthusiasts declared it proof of spontaneous human teleportation. Skeptics declared it obviously a glitch, probably caused by video compression or a momentary camera malfunction. Reddit threads spawned subthreads, spawned arguments that probably continued long after everyone involved should have gone to bed. The truth, as usual, lurked somewhere in the murky waters between definitely supernatural and definitely explicable. But before we dive into the analysis of Robert's disappearing act, let's travel back in time to 1997 and visit the state of Georgia, where a completely different kind of vanishing occurred. One involving not a person, but a car, and not a doorbell camera, but a police chase. The incident took place on a rural highway outside Atlanta, in the kind of area where farmland gives way to forest, and cell phone reception is more of a suggestion than a guarantee. A patrol officer named Deputy Marcus Freeman was pursuing a vehicle that had been reported stolen about 20 minutes earlier. The chase was proceeding as chases typically do, the stolen car speeding ahead, Deputy Freeman following with lights and sirens, both vehicles eating up miles of empty highway while dispatch coordinated backup units. Nothing about the pursuit seemed unusual, at least not until they reached a stretch of road bordered on one side by dense woods and on the other by a property enclosed with chain-link fencing. According to Deputy Freeman's report, and this is where the story gets weird, the stolen vehicle suddenly veered off the road and headed directly toward the chain-link fence at approximately 60 miles per hour. Freeman expected to witness a crash. Chain-link fencing isn't exactly a formidable barrier, but it's not nothing either. A car hitting it at that speed should have torn through the fence, leaving behind bent metal, broken posts, and a clear path of destruction. Instead, Deputy Freeman watched the vehicle pass through the fence as if it weren't there. The car didn't break the fence. It didn't push through it. It didn't go over it or under it. According to the deputy's testimony, the vehicle simply went through it, like a ghost passing through a wall. One moment the car was on the road side of the fence, the next moment it was on the other side, and the fence itself was completely intact. No damage, no disturbance, not even a wobble in the chain-link mesh. The stolen car continued across the property and disappeared into the tree line. And by the time Freeman got out of his patrol vehicle to examine the fence, there was nothing to suggest that anything had passed through it at all. The vehicle was never recovered. The driver was never identified. The case remains technically open, filed under circumstances that no one at the Sheriff's Department has ever been able to adequately explain. Deputy Freeman, who had been on the force for nearly 15 years at the time of the incident, had no history of making unusual claims, and no apparent reason to fabricate such a story. His dashcam was running during the pursuit, but the quality of 1997 police dashcam footage, let's just say it left something to be desired. The recording shows the chase, shows the car veering toward the fence, and then shows, well, it's not entirely clear what it shows. The image quality degrades at exactly the wrong moment, leaving analysts to argue about whether the footage supports Freeman's account or contradicts it. Two cases, separated by over 2 decades, both suggesting that solid objects can sometimes behave in ways that violate everything we think we know about physics. Coincidence? Hoax? Equipment malfunction? Or something genuinely inexplicable? To understand why these cases have attracted so much attention from researchers and enthusiasts alike, we need to talk about teleportation, not as science fiction, but as a concept that has roots going back thousands of years. The idea that people or objects can instantaneously travel from one place to another appears in religious and mystical traditions across virtually every culture. In Jewish Kabbalah, there are accounts of righteous individuals being miraculously transported across vast distances through divine intervention, a concept called Kefitzat Haderech, literally, the shortening of the way. Christian hagiography includes numerous stories of saints appearing in multiple locations simultaneously or being transported by angels. Islamic tradition describes the prophet's night journey from Mecca to Jerusalem and then through the heavens. Hindu epics feature characters moving instantaneously across the subcontinent through yogic powers. The theme is remarkably consistent. Under certain special circumstances, the normal rules of space and movement can be suspended. For most of human history, these stories existed purely in the realm of faith and mythology. But in the 20th and 21st centuries, something interesting happened. Physics started suggesting that teleportation might not be entirely impossible after all. Not human teleportation, mind you. We're nowhere close to beaming people around like in Star Trek. But quantum teleportation, the instantaneous transfer of quantum states between particles, has been demonstrated in laboratories around the world. In 2017, Chinese scientists successfully teleported the quantum state of a photon from Earth to a satellite orbiting 870 miles overhead. The particle itself didn't move, but its quantum information was instantaneously transferred across that distance, seemingly without traveling through the intervening space. Now, quantum teleportation and the kind of macro-scale teleportation depicted in our Texas and Georgia cases are very different things. Teleporting the quantum state of a photon is not the same as teleporting a human being or a car. The physics involved doesn't scale up in any way we currently understand. A person contains roughly 7 octillion atoms, each with its own quantum state. And the idea of instantaneously transferring all that information, while also somehow dematerializing the physical matter and reconstituting it elsewhere, is so far beyond our current capabilities that it might as well be magic. But, and this is an important but, the fact that any form of teleportation works at all suggests that our classical intuitions about space and locality might be incomplete. The universe, it turns out, is stranger than we gave it credit for. Does this mean Robert Dawson teleported off his front porch? Does it mean a stolen car in Georgia passed through solid matter? Almost certainly not. The gap between quantum phenomena and human-scale events is enormous, and there's no known mechanism that would allow the principles of quantum teleportation to apply to macroscopic objects. But the existence of quantum teleportation does something important for these cases. It takes them out of the realm of pure fantasy and places them in a gray zone where impossible might just mean not yet understood. For believers in the paranormal, these cases represent potential evidence that reality isn't as solid and predictable as mainstream science insists. For skeptics, they represent examples of how equipment failures, perceptual errors, and the human tendency to find meaning in ambiguity can create apparent mysteries out of mundane malfunctions. The truth, frustratingly, probably lies somewhere in between. Though which side of between it's closer to remains a matter of heated debate. Let's start with the Texas doorbell footage, because that's the case where the explanation, once you hear it, makes you want to slap your forehead and mutter, "Of course," under your breath. A video analyst named Derek Santoro, who has spent over a decade examining digital footage for legal cases and media investigations, took a deep dive into Robert Dawson's apparent disappearance. His findings were simultaneously disappointing for paranormal enthusiasts and deeply educational for anyone who doesn't fully understand how their smart home devices actually work. Here's the thing about doorbell cameras. They're not professional surveillance equipment. They're consumer devices designed to be affordable, easy to install, and unobtrusive enough that your neighbors don't think you're running some kind of intelligence operation from your suburban home. To achieve these goals, manufacturers make compromises, And one of the biggest compromises involves video compression. High-definition video takes up an enormous amount of storage space and bandwidth. Your doorbell camera is constantly recording, potentially 24 hours a day, and that footage needs to be transmitted over your home Wi-Fi to cloud servers, where it can be stored and accessed from your phone. If doorbell cameras recorded and transmitted raw, uncompressed video, your internet bill would look like a mortgage payment, and the servers would collapse under the weight of millions of hours of footage showing absolutely nothing happening on people's porches. The solution is aggressive compression. Doorbell cameras use algorithms that essentially decide what's important in each frame and what can be discarded or approximated. Static elements, like your porch steps, your door, that potted plant your spouse keeps asking you to water, get compressed heavily because they don't change from frame to frame. Moving elements get more attention because that's what you actually care about. People approaching your door, packages being delivered, raccoons investigating your recycling bins at 3 a.m. The system works remarkably well most of the time, but it has failure modes, and those failure modes can produce footage that looks genuinely bizarre to the untrained eye. Derek Santoro identified exactly what happened in the Dawson footage. At the moment Robert appeared to vanish, the camera experienced what's called a compression artifact cascade, triggered by a brief interruption in the internet connection. The camera was in the middle of transmitting frames when the Wi-Fi hiccuped. Not a full disconnection, just a momentary stutter lasting perhaps a fraction of a second. The camera's software, suddenly unable to send the frames it had just captured, had to make decisions about what to do with them. Some frames got dropped entirely. Others got corrupted during the recovery process. And the sphere of light that seemed to appear where Robert's body should have been? That was the compression algorithm's attempt to reconcile two incompatible frames. Essentially, a visual error message. The camera's equivalent of throwing up its hands and generating placeholder data because it didn't know what else to do. The result, when played back at normal speed, looks like a man dissolving into light. But when Santoro examined the raw data, the actual file information rather than the rendered video, he could see exactly where the frames were missing and exactly what the compression algorithm had done to paper over the gap. There was no teleportation. There was no disappearance. There was just a cheap camera doing its best to handle a bad Wi-Fi moment and producing output that happened to look like something out of a science fiction movie. Robert Dawson, for his part, was never particularly invested in the paranormal interpretation. He posted the video because he thought it was funny, a weird glitch that made him look like he'd been abducted by aliens. He didn't expect it to go viral, didn't expect to receive hundreds of messages from people convinced he'd experienced something supernatural, and definitely didn't expect to be contacted by researchers wanting to run experiments on him. He still uses the same doorbell camera, by the way. It's produced several more glitchy videos since then, though none as dramatic as the original. Apparently, Robert's Wi-Fi router has a sense of comedic timing. Now let's address the Georgia fence incident, because that one has haunted Deputy Marcus Freeman for years. Unlike the doorbell footage, the fence case didn't have high-quality video to analyze. 1997 police dashcam technology was, to put it charitably, not great. What investigators did have was the physical evidence, a fence that a car had apparently passed through without damaging, and a deputy's testimony that he'd witnessed something that should have been impossible. For years, the case sat in that uncomfortable category of unexplained, but probably explicable if we just knew what to look for. The answer came from an unlikely source, a property records investigation conducted in 2003 by a detective named Lieutenant Howard Chen, who had inherited the cold case file and decided to dig into the history of the fence itself. What he discovered was less supernatural and more a testament to the creative incompetence of amateur fence installation. The fence in question had been erected by the property owner approximately 6 months before the chase incident. The owner, in a money-saving move that probably seemed clever at the time, had installed the fence himself rather than hiring a professional contractor. His approach to construction was, let's call it, unorthodox. Rather than setting proper concrete footings for the fence posts, a process that requires digging, mixing, pouring, and waiting for curing, he'd used a system of weighted bases and ground stakes that allowed the fence to be freestanding without permanent installation. This made the fence technically portable, which appealed to the owner for reasons that made sense to him at the time, but that we don't need to examine too closely. The critical design flaw was the gate section. The property had a wide driveway entrance, and rather than building a traditional swinging gate, the owner had created a system where an entire panel of fencing could pivot outward from a single vertical post. When latched, the panel looked like a solid part of the fence line, When unlatched, or when hit by a car traveling at 60 miles per hour, the panel would swing open like a very large, very aggressive door. Here's what Lieutenant Chen reconstructed. When the stolen vehicle veered toward the fence, it struck the pivoting panel dead center. The impact, rather than breaking through the fence, triggered the panel's pivot mechanism, causing it to swing rapidly outward, and then, thanks to a spring mechanism the owner had installed to auto-close the gate, swing immediately back into the closed position. The entire sequence took less than 2 seconds. From Deputy Freeman's perspective, following behind at chase distance, it genuinely looked like the car had passed through solid fencing. The panel swung open, the car went through, the panel swung closed. And by the time Freeman reached the fence, there was no visible damage because there had been no collision with the fence structure itself, just a gate doing exactly what gates are designed to do, albeit in a very unexpected context. The property owner confirmed this explanation when Chen finally tracked him down. Yes, the gate panel had been knocked loose from its latch that night. Yes, he'd found it swinging in the breeze the next morning and had to re-secure it. No, he hadn't thought to connect this to any police activity, because he hadn't even known there'd been a chase through his property until Chen showed up asking questions 6 years later. The mystery of the ghost car passing through solid matter was solved. It was just a badly built fence doing badly built fence things. Deputy Freeman, when informed of the explanation, reportedly experienced a mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief that he hadn't witnessed something that violated the fundamental laws of physics. Disappointment that the most interesting thing that had ever happened during his career had a mundane explanation involving cheap fence construction and spring-loaded hinges. He retired in 2012, and according to colleagues, still tells the story at department barbecues, though now he tells it as a lesson about how weird things can look from the wrong angle rather than evidence of supernatural phenomena. So both of our teleportation cases have been debunked, filed away in the growing collection of weird videos with boring explanations. Does this mean teleportation is definitively impossible? Not exactly. And this is where the story takes an interesting turn. Because while humans in cars aren't beaming around like Star Trek characters, the science of teleportation has been quietly advancing in ways that would have seemed like pure fiction just a few decades ago. We mentioned the Chinese quantum teleportation experiment earlier, and it's worth diving a bit deeper into what that actually achieved. In 2017, a team of scientists led by researcher Jianwei Pan successfully teleported the quantum state of a photon from a ground station in Tibet to a satellite called Misius orbiting 870 miles overhead. To be clear about what this means, they didn't teleport the photon itself. The physical particle stayed where it was. What they teleported was its quantum state, essentially the complete information about the particle's properties at a given moment. This information appeared instantaneously at the distant location, faster than light could have traveled between the 2 points, seemingly without passing through the intervening space. This is deeply weird, and physicists are still arguing about exactly what it implies about the nature of reality. The phenomenon relies on something called quantum entanglement, where 2 particles become correlated in such a way that measuring one instantly affects the other, regardless of the distance between them. Einstein famously called this spooky action at a distance, and spent considerable effort trying to prove it couldn't really work the way quantum mechanics predicted. He was wrong. Entanglement is real. Quantum teleportation works. And the universe is apparently more connected and less local than classical physics suggests. Now, the jump from teleporting quantum states to teleporting people is enormous, possibly infinite in practical terms. A human body contains approximately 7 billion atoms, each with its own quantum state that would need to be captured, transmitted, and reconstituted. The computational and energy requirements for such an operation are so far beyond current technology that they might as well be magic. The philosopher Derek Parfit famously argued that even if we could teleport humans, doing so would essentially kill the original and create a copy, raising thorny questions about identity and consciousness that make the physics look simple by comparison. But here's the thing that keeps the dream alive. 50 years ago, the idea of teleporting anything at all was pure science fiction. Now we're teleporting quantum states across hundreds of miles. The progress is incremental, the challenges are immense, but the direction of travel is clear. Each year, quantum teleportation experiments achieve longer distances, higher fidelity, and more complex states. The technology is finding practical applications in quantum computing and ultra-secure communications. And somewhere in the back of everyone's mind who works in this field is the tantalizing question: If we can teleport information, could we eventually teleport matter? The answer, as far as current physics can determine, is probably not. But we've been wrong about probably not before. Beam Me Up, Scotty remains firmly in the realm of fiction, but it's moved from completely impossible to almost certainly impossible, but we can't prove it. In the world of science, that's actually a significant shift. The universe keeps revealing that it's stranger than we thought, and the history of physics is littered with confident pronouncements about what was impossible that turned out to be merely difficult. So while Robert Dawson didn't teleport off his porch, and the Georgia car didn't phase through a fence, the dream of instantaneous travel isn't entirely dead. It's just waiting for technology to catch up with imagination, which, if history is any guide, might take a while, but isn't necessarily forever. Until then, we'll have to content ourselves with airports, traffic jams, and the occasional glitchy doorbell video that makes us wonder, just for a moment, whether the impossible might actually be possible after all. We've covered lights that defy physics, faces that emerge from concrete, lakes that mummify animals, and apparent teleportations that turned out to be technological hiccups. But our final case is perhaps the most visually striking and conceptually mind-bending of them all. It involves a mirror, a forest, and the unsettling possibility that stepping through a reflective surface might land you somewhere that isn't quite the world you left behind. Welcome to the rabbit hole, Alice. Except this time, the rabbit hole is in Oregon, and someone filmed the whole thing. May 2017. The forests outside Portland are doing what Pacific Northwest forests do best, being impossibly green, slightly damp, and atmospheric enough to serve as the backdrop for approximately 70% of all indie horror films. A hiker named Tyler Morrison is out for a weekend trek through one of the state's countless wilderness areas, camera in hand, documenting his journey for a nature vlog that, by his own admission, usually attracted about 40 viewers per video. Mostly family members obligated by blood to pretend they cared about his hiking adventures. What he captured on this particular outing would change that viewer count dramatically, though not in any way he could have predicted. About 3 hours into his hike, Tyler came across something that shouldn't have been there. A full-length mirror standing upright in a small clearing, propped against nothing, reflecting the forest back at itself as if it had every right to exist, in the middle of nowhere. Now, finding random objects in forests isn't unheard of. Hikers encounter everything from abandoned cars to inexplicable furniture to the occasional creepy doll that definitely wasn't placed there by someone trying to terrify strangers. But a mirror this size, this intact, this deliberately positioned? That was unusual enough to make Tyler stop, pull out his camera, and start recording. The video, which has since accumulated millions of views across various platforms, shows Tyler approaching the mirror with the cautious curiosity of someone who has watched enough horror movies to know that mysterious objects in forests rarely lead to good things, but is going to investigate anyway, because content is content. He narrates as he walks, noting the mirror's condition, surprisingly pristine, no cracks or weathering despite being exposed to the elements. Its size, roughly 6 feet tall, maybe 2 feet wide, and its placement, perfectly vertical, facing a gap between 2 large trees. And then, with the kind of casual bravery that either reflects genuine courage or a profound failure of survival instincts, Tyler decides to walk through the space where the mirror is standing. Here's where things get weird. In the video, Tyler approaches the mirror head-on. His reflection grows larger as he gets closer, completely normal mirror behavior. And then, instead of stopping or stepping around it, he appears to walk directly into the reflective surface and emerge on the other side. Not around it, through it. The mirror seems to part for him like water, his image disappearing into the glass and his body appearing on the opposite side in one continuous motion. It looks, for all the world, like he's stepping through a portal. Tyler, clearly startled by what just happened, spins around to look back at where he came from. And here's where viewers who've watched the video 1,000 times still pause and squint. The ivy on the tree behind the mirror appears to be on a different side than it was before he walked through. In the before shots, there's a distinctive pattern of ivy climbing up the left side of a large oak. In the after shots, with Tyler now on the other side of the mirror, the ivy appears to be on the right, as if he's not just standing in a different position, but in a subtly different version of the same forest. A mirror image, if you will, of the reality he started in. The video ends with Tyler, understandably freaked out, backing away from the mirror and eventually turning to hike rapidly in the direction of his car. His narration becomes less coherent as the video progresses, a mix of profanity and genuine confusion that feels too raw to be performed. He uploaded the footage that night, added some minimal commentary, and went to bed, expecting his usual 40 viewers to offer their usual 40 lukewarm reactions. He woke up to discover that the internet had found it. The video exploded across social media with the intensity of a cultural phenomenon. Paranormal communities declared it the clearest evidence yet of interdimensional travel. Physics enthusiasts started debating whether the footage could possibly show what it appeared to show. Skeptics immediately cried hoax, though they couldn't quite agree on how the hoax had been achieved. Tyler Morrison, nature vlogger with a modest following, had accidentally stepped into something much larger than a weekend hike. He'd stepped into one of the oldest and most persistent questions in human philosophy. Are there other worlds beyond our own? And if so, can we reach them? The concept of mirrors as portals between dimensions is deeply embedded in human culture, and not just because Lewis Carroll wrote a very famous book about it. Across virtually every civilization that developed the technology to create reflective surfaces, there are myths and traditions treating mirrors as more than just tools for checking your appearance. Ancient cultures covered mirrors during funerals, believing they could trap the souls of the living or provide pathways for the dead to return. Folklore around the world warns against looking into mirrors at midnight, summoning spirits by saying names into mirrors, or breaking mirrors and shattering not just glass, but luck. The mirror has always occupied an uncanny position in human consciousness, showing us ourselves, but reversed, presenting a world that looks like ours, but isn't quite. Modern physics, surprisingly, doesn't entirely dismiss the possibility of parallel dimensions. String theory, one of the leading candidates for a theory of everything that would unify quantum mechanics and general relativity, proposes that the universe we perceive is actually embedded in a higher dimensional space. Depending on which version of string theory you're working with, there could be 10, 11, or even more dimensions beyond the 4 we experience, 3 spatial dimensions plus time. We can't perceive these extra dimensions directly, because they're either compactified, curled up so small that they're invisible at any scale we can observe, or because we're confined to a 4-dimensional brain floating in a higher dimensional bulk, like 2-dimensional creatures living on the surface of a bubble, unaware of the 3-dimensional space around them. If these extra dimensions exist, and if parallel universes exist within them, another prediction of certain physics models, then the question becomes, could there be places where the boundary between our world and another becomes thin enough to cross? Could certain configurations of matter and energy create temporary bridges, portals, doorways between realities? Most physicists would say this is extremely unlikely, that even if parallel dimensions exist, the energy required to access them would be astronomical, far beyond anything that could occur naturally on a forest floor in Oregon. But extremely unlikely isn't the same as impossible, and the history of physics is full of things that were considered impossible until someone figured out how to do them. Interestingly, there have been actual scientific experiments designed to detect evidence of parallel dimensions, and some of them involve exactly the kind of boundary crossing that Tyler's video seems to depict. In 2019, physicists at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Tennessee conducted experiments with neutrons, subatomic particles that make up part of every atomic nucleus, to test whether they might be oscillating between our universe and a parallel mirror universe. The hypothesis, based on certain anomalies in how neutrons decay, suggested that neutrons might occasionally slip into a parallel dimension where the laws of physics are slightly different, becoming what scientists call mirror neutrons. Before slipping back. The experiments didn't find evidence supporting this hypothesis, but the fact that they were conducted at all by serious scientists at a major research institution using rigorous methodology tells you something about how mainstream physics views the parallel dimension question. It's not taken for granted, but it's not dismissed as pure fantasy either. So could Tyler Morrison have walked through a portal to a parallel dimension in the forests of Oregon? Could the mirror have been some kind of natural or unnatural gateway to an alternate reality? Could the shifted ivy be evidence that he briefly stepped into a world where left and right are reversed, where everything is almost identical but subtly, disturbingly different? The romantic in us wants to say yes. The idea is irresistible, that hidden in ordinary places there might be doorways to extraordinary ones, that the world is more magical and mysterious than our everyday experience suggests. Every child who has ever touched a mirror hoping it would ripple like water, every reader who has wished they could follow Alice through the looking glass, every person who has looked at their reflection and wondered who that reversed stranger really is. is some part of all of us wants parallel dimensions to be real and accessible, wants the universe to be that kind of place. But before we get too carried away with interdimensional tourism fantasies, there's another possibility we need to consider. That what Tyler's video shows is not a portal to another dimension, but a very clever trick performed by someone who understands exactly how cameras, mirrors, and editing software work. And that possibility, frustrating as it might be for those hoping for genuine evidence of the paranormal, is going to require its own examination. Because the line between the impossible and the merely impressive is often much thinner than viral videos would have us believe. The physics of what the video appears to show are, when you think about them carefully, deeply problematic. If Tyler genuinely walked through a portal into a parallel dimension, we'd need to explain how that portal was opened, what sustained it, why it happened to be there, and how Tyler was able to perceive and interact with it at all. The energy requirements alone would be staggering. Theoretical calculations suggest that creating even a microscopic wormhole, which is the closest thing physics has to a portal, would require negative energy densities that may not even be possible in our universe. A human-sized portal standing casually in an Oregon forest, requiring no visible power source, stable enough to walk through, and considerate enough to deposit its travelers safely in a nearly identical parallel world? The physics doesn't just not support it, the physics actively rebels against the very concept. The multiverse hypothesis, while scientifically legitimate as a theoretical framework, doesn't actually predict that you can walk between universes. In most versions of multiverse theory, parallel dimensions are causally disconnected from our own, meaning not just that we can't visit them, but that by definition, nothing can pass between them. They're parallel in the mathematical sense, running alongside our reality, but never intersecting. The idea of a mirror serving as a crosswalk between realities makes for great fiction, but doesn't correspond to any physical theory that scientists take seriously. And yet, the video exists. The footage shows something. Tyler Morrison's reaction appears genuine. The Ivy discrepancy is visible to anyone who watches carefully. Something is going on in that video, even if that something turns out to be much more mundane than interdimensional travel. The question isn't whether the video is interesting. It clearly is. The question is what the video actually shows, and whether the extraordinary interpretation is more plausible than the ordinary one. That question deserves a proper investigation, which is exactly what our final segment will provide. Mirrors, angles, editing techniques, and the art of making the impossible look possible. We're going to pull back the curtain and see what's really behind the glass. Because sometimes the most impressive trick is making people believe there was no trick at all. Let's start with the science, because it's important to understand exactly what we're up against when we talk about walking into parallel dimensions. Dr. Kenji Nakamura, an astrophysicist who has spent 2 decades studying cosmology and theoretical physics, offers a perspective that's both fascinating and, for portal enthusiasts, deeply disappointing. According to Nakamura, even if parallel universes exist, which certain interpretations of quantum mechanics and string theory suggest they might, the idea of physically entering one is fundamentally misguided. It's not just that we lack the technology, it's that the very concept may be incoherent given what we understand about the nature of reality. Here's the issue, as Nakamura explains it. Parallel universes, in most theoretical frameworks, aren't places in the same sense that Portland or Tokyo are places. They're not locations you could theoretically travel to if you just had a fast enough spaceship or a magic mirror. They're entire separate realities, potentially with different physical constants, different histories, different versions of matter and energy. The distance between our universe and a parallel one isn't measurable in miles or light years. It's a conceptual distance, a separation in the mathematical space of possibilities rather than the physical space of coordinates. Asking how to walk to a parallel universe is a bit like asking how to walk to the number 7. The question sounds meaningful, but it doesn't actually correspond to anything that makes physical sense. Even in models where parallel dimensions are somehow adjacent to our own, the brain cosmology scenarios we discussed earlier, interaction between dimensions would occur at the level of fundamental particles, not macroscopic objects like humans. If particles from another dimension were leaking into ours, we might detect anomalies in particle physics experiments, unusual gravitational effects, or subtle deviations in the constants of nature. What we would not see is a hiker in Oregon stepping through a mirror and finding himself in dimension B. The scales are all wrong. It would be like trying to send an email by physically throwing your computer at the recipient. The mechanism simply doesn't work that way. Nakamura also points out something that often gets lost in popular discussions of parallel universes. Even if you could somehow cross into another dimension, there's no reason to expect it would look anything like ours. The Oregon forest on the other side of Tyler's mirror would, in all likelihood, not be an Oregon forest at all. It might be a void. It might be a reality where the fundamental forces work differently, and matter as we know it can't exist. It might be something so alien that our brains literally couldn't process the sensory input. The cinematic idea of parallel dimensions as slightly altered versions of our world, where everything is the same except maybe evil versions of people have goatees, is storytelling convenience, not scientific prediction. So from a physics standpoint, the mirror portal video fails before we even examine the footage itself. Whatever Tyler Morrison encountered in that forest, it almost certainly wasn't a gateway to another universe. The physics doesn't support it. The theoretical frameworks don't predict it. And the specific visual evidence, ivy appearing on a different side of a tree, is exactly the kind of small, local change that screams camera trick rather than dimensional breach. Which brings us to the investigation conducted by Vincent Galloway, a professional skeptic and video analyst who has built a career on dissecting viral paranormal footage. Galloway approaches these things with the methodical patience of a forensic accountant and the dry humor of someone who has seen every trick in the book and invented a few new ones just for fun. His analysis of the mirror portal video is a masterclass in how to deceive viewers using nothing more than careful positioning, basic prop manipulation, and the magic of video editing. Let's start with the mirror itself. Galloway points out that the angle at which Tyler approaches the mirror is absolutely critical to understanding what's happening. When you walk toward a mirror head-on, you see your reflection growing larger as you get closer. This is basic optics, and it's what makes the video initially appear so convincing. But mirrors have what's called a blind angle, an approach vector at approximately 45 degrees where the viewer's reflection is directed away from the camera's line of sight. If you approach a mirror from this angle while the camera stays stationary, you can get very close to the mirror without your reflection being visible in the footage. You could, in fact, walk right up to the edge of the mirror, and from the camera's perspective, it would look like you were walking into it. This is exactly what Galloway believes happened. Tyler didn't walk through the mirror, he walked around it, but at an angle that made around look like through from the camera's fixed position. The mirror itself may have been mounted on a pivot or simply held by an accomplice hidden behind the frame, allowing it to be rotated slightly as Tyler passed. This rotation, combined with clever camera angles, creates the illusion of passing through a solid surface. It's the same basic principle behind countless stage magic tricks: misdirection, angles, and the audience's willingness to believe what they think they're seeing rather than what's actually happening. But what about the ivy? That's the detail that makes the video so compelling. The apparent evidence that Tyler ended up in a slightly different version of reality. Galloway's explanation is elegant in its simplicity: editing. The before and after shots of the tree with the ivy aren't continuous footage. There's a cut, subtle, well hidden but present, between the moment Tyler appears to enter the mirror and the moment he turns around to look back. During this cut, the footage was manipulated. The simplest method would be to flip the after footage horizontally, creating a mirror image of the original forest that would make everything appear reversed, including the ivy. A more sophisticated approach would involve filming the same location from slightly different positions and editing the clips together to create the appearance of a single continuous shot. Galloway actually reconstructed the entire trick to demonstrate how achievable it is. Using a standard full-length mirror, a basic consumer camera, and about 2 hours of practice, he was able to create footage that looked almost identical to Tyler's original video. His version shows him walking toward a mirror in his backyard, appearing to pass through it, and emerging on the other side where, through the magic of horizontal flip editing, the garden gnome that was on his left is now on his right. The whole thing cost him about $40 and required no special effects software beyond what comes free with most computers. If a skeptic in his backyard can recreate the effect in an afternoon, the likelihood that the original video captured a genuine dimensional portal drops precipitously. The really clever part of the original video, Galloway notes, is Tyler's performance. His apparent confusion, his stammered narration, his decision to flee the scene, all of it feels authentic because, Galloway suspects, much of it was authentic. Tyler may have genuinely believed in the moment that something strange had happened. Or he may have been performing so well that even he got caught up in the bit. Either way, the emotional authenticity of his reaction is what sells the illusion. We're not just evaluating the visual evidence. We're evaluating Tyler's behavior, and our brains use that behavior as evidence for the reality of what he experienced. It's a well-documented psychological phenomenon. When someone appears genuinely shocked or frightened, we're primed to believe that whatever shocked or frightened them must be real. Tyler Morrison, for his part, has never definitively confirmed or denied that the video was staged. In subsequent interviews, he's maintained a position of ambiguity, saying things like, "I can't explain what happened," and "I'll let viewers draw their own conclusions." This is, Galloway notes, exactly what you'd expect from someone who created a viral hoax and wants to keep the mystery alive without actually lying. Admitting it's fake would kill the engagement. Insisting it's real would open him up to more rigorous scrutiny and potential embarrassment. Strategic ambiguity lets him have it both ways. The video stays viral, the comments stay active, and Tyler never has to commit to a story that could be definitively disproven. So what's our final verdict on the Mirror Portal of Oregon? Impressive. Genuinely impressive, actually. The video demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of camera angles, viewer psychology, and the art of digital editing. As a piece of filmmaking, it's clever and effective. As evidence of interdimensional travel, however, it falls apart under scrutiny. The physics doesn't work. The visual evidence can be explained by mundane techniques. The creator's behavior is consistent with someone maintaining a profitable hoax, rather than someone who genuinely experienced something unexplainable. The Mirror Portal joins our collection of debunked phenomena, not because we can prove with absolute certainty that it was faked, but because the fake explanation is so much more plausible than the paranormal one that Occam's razor practically swings itself. When the choice is between the laws of physics were locally suspended to create a portal to another dimension that happens to look exactly like our world but with reversed ivy, and a guy with a mirror and some editing software made a cool video, the second option wins by a landslide. Does this mean parallel dimensions don't exist? No. Does it mean mirrors can never be portals? We can't prove a universal negative. Does it mean this specific video isn't evidence for either claim? Absolutely. Tyler Morrison may have found a doorway to another reality, but far more likely, he found a doorway to internet fame, built it himself out of props and pixels, and walked through it with a grin that we just couldn't see from the camera's angle. And honestly, there's something almost as magical about that. The ability to create wonder, to make people question reality, to spark debates and investigations and millions of views, using nothing but creativity and technical skill. That's its own kind of portal. Not to another dimension, but to a world where a random hiker can become an internet sensation, where 40 viewers can become 4 million, where a mirror in the woods can launch 1,000 theories. It's not physics-defying magic, but it's magic nonetheless. So here we are, at the end of our journey through 5 of the most intriguing phenomena that have captured the internet's imagination and challenged our understanding of what's possible. We've traveled from the suburbs of Houston to the villages of Spain, from the alkaline shores of Tanzania to the forests of Oregon, with a stop in Georgia to watch a car apparently phase through solid matter. We've consulted astrophysicists and video analysts, biologists and skeptics, chemical labs and quantum physicists. And now it's time to take stock of what we've learned, and perhaps more importantly, what we still don't know. Let's run through our scoreboard, shall we? Of the 5 phenomena we investigated, 3 have been definitively explained. The Lake Natron death lake that supposedly turned animals to stone, natural mummification chemistry, the same process ancient Egyptians used, combined with a photographer who arranged already preserved specimens for artistic effect. Impressive nature photography, fascinating science, but no supernatural death rays or African demons required. The case is closed, the file is stamped explained, and the flamingos continue to raise their babies in one of the world's most hostile environments, because evolution has a sense of humor that we're only beginning to appreciate. The teleportation cases? Both debunked, though through very different mechanisms. Robert Dawson's vanishing act on his front porch was nothing more than video compression artifacts meeting Wi-Fi instability. A technological hiccup that produced footage looking like something out of a science fiction film, but was actually just a cheap camera doing its best with a bad internet connection. And the Georgia ghost car that passed through a chain-link fence? A badly installed gate with a pivot mechanism, swinging open on impact and closing again so fast that it looked like the vehicle had phased through solid matter. Not exactly the stuff of physics textbooks, but not the stuff of paranormal case files either. just human error and fence construction meeting human perception under stress, creating a story that took years to unravel. The Oregon Mirror Portal? Almost certainly a hoax, and a clever one at that. The angles were carefully chosen, the editing was skillfully executed, and the performer's apparent confusion was convincing enough to sell the illusion. We can't prove with absolute certainty that Tyler Morrison didn't step into another dimension. You can never prove a universal negative. But the mundane explanation is so much more plausible that Occam's razor doesn't even need to be sharp. A guy with a mirror and some video editing skills created a viral sensation. It's impressive in its own way, just not in the way the video implies. That leaves us with two cases that refuse to close neatly. Two phenomena that, despite rigorous investigation, extensive analysis, and the best efforts of scientists and skeptics alike, remain stubbornly, frustratingly, fascinatingly unexplained. The blue flash in Houston. Sandra Holloway's living room, flooded with impossible light that cast no proper shadows, recorded on security footage that shows missing frames no one can account for. The chemical analysis found nothing. The meteorological data showed no atmospheric explanation. The video experts identified anomalies that shouldn't exist if this were either a natural phenomenon or a simple hoax. Sandra's subjective experience of time dilation, her recurring cosmic dreams, the strange behavior of birds on her roof in the minutes before the incident. None of it has been satisfactorily explained. The temporal anomaly theory remains on the table, not because it's been proven, but because nothing else fits better. The case sits in our unexplained file, staring back at us with the patience of a mystery that knows it might never be solved. And then there are the faces of Belmez. Over 50 years of investigation, multiple floor replacements, chemical analysis that found no paint, no dye, no artificial agents. The discovery of an ancient burial ground beneath the house. The ongoing appearance of new faces even after the original witnesses died. The sheer persistence of a phenomenon that refuses to stop even when there's no apparent motive for continuing. Hoax. The Belmez faces have been examined by more researchers, photographed more times, and debated more intensely than almost any other alleged paranormal phenomenon in modern history. And still, we don't know. We can't prove the faces are genuine manifestations of something beyond our understanding. We can't prove their elaborate trickery. They exist in that maddening gray zone where evidence accumulates but conclusions refuse to form. What do we make of cases like these? How do we hold space for the unexplained without abandoning our commitment to rationality and evidence-based thinking? Here's the thing that gets lost in a lot of discussions about paranormal phenomena. Skepticism and wonder aren't opposites, they're partners. The best scientists in history, the ones who made the breakthroughs that transformed our understanding of reality, were people who combined rigorous skepticism with genuine openness to the unexpected. They demanded evidence, insisted on reproducibility, rejected claims that couldn't withstand scrutiny. But they also recognized that the universe is under no obligation to make sense to us, that our current understanding is always provisional, always subject to revision in the face of new data. When we investigate unexplained phenomena, we're not trying to prove the supernatural exists. We're not trying to debunk everything and smugly declare that science has all the answers. We're doing something more interesting than either of those. We're mapping the boundaries of human knowledge, identifying the places where our understanding breaks down, documenting the anomalies that might, just might, point toward discoveries we haven't made yet. History is full of phenomena that were once considered impossible, supernatural, or simply inexplicable, and that later turned out to have perfectly natural explanations that required entirely new frameworks of understanding. Ball lightning was dismissed as folklore for centuries, until scientists developed instruments sensitive enough to detect and study it. Meteorites, rocks falling from the sky, were considered peasant superstition by educated Europeans until the evidence became impossible to ignore. Continental drift was mocked as pseudoscience until plate tectonics provided the mechanism. The history of science is not a story of steady progress from ignorance to knowledge. It's a story of repeated humiliation, of confident experts being proven wrong by stubborn facts that refuse to fit their theories. This doesn't mean every unexplained phenomenon will eventually be explained by revolutionary new science. Most anomalies, when investigated thoroughly, turn out to have mundane explanations. Hoaxes, misperceptions, equipment failures, the countless ways that human beings can be fooled or can fool themselves. The Lake Natrons and mirror portals of the world remind us that our first instinct should always be skepticism. that extraordinary claims really do require extraordinary evidence, that the simplest explanation is usually correct. But the blue flashes and Belmez faces remind us of something equally important, that usually isn't always. That some mysteries persist despite our best efforts to solve them, that the universe might contain more than is dreamed of in our current philosophies. Holding both of these truths simultaneously, being skeptical and being open, demanding evidence and acknowledging uncertainty, is the intellectual posture that actual scientific progress requires. So what should you take away from our journey through these 5 phenomena? A few things, I hope. First, develop your critical thinking skills. Learn how video compression works. Understand why eyewitness testimony is unreliable. Know the difference between correlation and causation. The world is full of people trying to convince you of things that aren't true, whether for profit, for fame, or simply because they've convinced themselves. The best defense against being fooled is understanding the methods of foolery. Second, stay curious. Don't let skepticism curdle into cynicism. Just because most claims of the paranormal turn out to be bunk, doesn't mean asking questions is pointless. The person who never wonders what if will never discover anything new. The unexplained cases in our files today might be the breakthrough discoveries of tomorrow. Or they might remain forever mysterious, which is its own kind of valuable knowledge about the limits of what we can know. Third, get comfortable with uncertainty. This is hard for humans. We're pattern-seeking creatures who crave explanations, who feel anxious when we can't fit something into a neat category. But intellectual honesty sometimes requires saying, I don't know. Not as a cop-out, not as a prelude to wild speculation, but as a genuine acknowledgement that some questions don't have answers yet. The Belmez faces might be a hoax we haven't figured out. They might be a natural phenomenon we don't understand. They might be something else entirely. Living with that uncertainty, rather than forcing a premature conclusion, is a skill worth developing. And fourth, keep watching the skies, or the floors, or the lakes, or wherever the next unexplained phenomenon decides to manifest. The universe is vast and strange, and full of things we haven't discovered yet. Every generation thinks they've figured out most of how reality works, and every generation turns out to be wrong about something fundamental. The humility to recognize that we might be wrong, combined with the curiosity to keep investigating anyway, is what drives human knowledge forward. We've reached the end of this particular journey, but the investigation never really stops. Somewhere right now, someone is capturing footage of something they can't explain. Somewhere, a scientist is looking at data that doesn't fit the models. Somewhere, reality is doing something unexpected. And if we're lucky, and persistent, and rigorous, and open-minded, we might eventually understand what it's trying to tell us. Until then, the files remain open. The questions remain unanswered. And the boundary between what we know and what we don't continues to shift in ways we can't predict. If you've made it this far, thank you for joining me on this exploration of the weird, the wonderful, and the persistently inexplicable. If you enjoyed the journey, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next deep dive into phenomena that challenge our understanding of reality. Drop a comment with your thoughts. Which of these cases do you find most compelling? Are there unexplained phenomena you'd like to see investigated in future episodes? And if you've got your own strange experience that defies explanation, I want to hear about it. The truth, as they say, is out there. Or maybe it's in here, waiting to be discovered in the data we haven't analyzed yet, the connections we haven't made, the questions we haven't thought to ask. Either way, the search continues. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop asking what lies beyond the edge of the explainable. See you in the next one.